we'd like to start with Carl Hardy. There we go.
So I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the symposium, Four Directions Aboriginal Student Center, elders, and everyone for being here today. I'm really grateful and honored to be included. I've created this talk in hopes of contributing to the spirit of peace and friendship that I understand to be the intended basis of relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples on this land where I'm currently living as a white settler. This presentation reflects critically on Sir John A. Macdonald in a roundabout way, by thinking about what stories are told about the future and how our collective imaginations are shaped by the culture we live in. I'm starting from the premise that there is a deep interrelationship between how we view the past, what we experience in the present, and what seems desirable or undesirable, possible or impossible in terms of the future. So I didn't know who Sir John A. Macdonald was until I moved into an apartment on Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard here in Kingston when I came here to start my PhD at Queen's. When I arrived here from the States, I didn't know much about Canada, its history, and contemporary political and social issues, especially as they relate to Aboriginal peoples. While I started my graduate career having been politicized into thinking critically about capitalism, the nation state, and the environment, I grew up in Texas, where Canada was often talked about as a liberal haven of universal health care, unlocked doors, where slaves went to escape for freedom, and where war resistors fled to avoid the draft. During the past several years, I've learned a great deal about understanding myself as a white settler and about understanding the U.S., where I have citizenship, and Canada, where I'm currently living, studying, and teaching as settler colonial societies. I've been challenged to consider what it means for me as a white settler on this land to desire a hopeful future. And this has led me to explore the history and character of hope and collective imagination as expressed through popular narratives or stories that white settlers told themselves and continue to tell as rationales for committing acts of genocide and stealing land. The fact is that Canada is a white settler utopia, the product of stories of creating a new and better society built upon ideas of progress and becoming modern. Of course, these stories relied upon self-serving settler ideas of seeing themselves as progressive and modern, and therefore superior to Aboriginal peoples, who are viewed as backward and primitive in comparison. The historical record of settler government policies and actions, including but not limited to that of Sir John A. Macdonald, shows that it's clear that Aboriginal peoples, their cultures and ways of life were not a part of an envisioned future Canada. Chickasaw scholar Jody Berg has written about what she calls the endless deferral of the concerns and experiences of Indigenous peoples. And I think this applies not only to the avoidance of historical realities of Canada and John A. Macdonald, but also to the constraining of our collective imaginations about what the future could be. When we cannot imagine otherwise, the mythologizing of Canada and its national figures like John A. Macdonald can seem permanent. The power of popular colonial narratives and the institutions they sustain are so great that it can somehow seem easier to imagine the end of the world, or interstellar travel through wormholes, or humanity being enslaved or saved by aliens, than to envision the end of settler colonialism. So, Indigenous and allied scholars have recognized how stories of the future popularly told through science fiction and fantasy have historically left Indigenous peoples out altogether, or else used them as symbols of the past, sometimes a romantic and noble past, sometimes a brutal or savage one. But the absence of Indigenous peoples' perspectives and narratives of the future has a great bearing on both the here and now and how we confront history. A recent book by a prominent non-Indigenous scholar of science fiction studies has argued that the emergence of the popular genre that we now know as science fiction developed in tandem with the global imperialism of the 19th century, as European colonial domination came to control approximately 80% of land on Earth prior to World War I. But today I'd like to argue that there are some signs of a shift in the stories of the future in popular culture as it pertains to Indigenous peoples, diasporic peoples of color, and white settlers. There are many reasons for this, not the least of which is the strength of resurgent Indigenous liberation movements like Island Moore, the creativity of Indigenous artists, and the emergence of a vibrant Indigenous studies, all of which demonstrate an active Indigenous presence that cannot be ignored and challenges a rethinking of both official settler histories and settler-dominated stories of the future. Of course, on this land, on Turtle Island, we are positioned very differently, and there are certainly many other considerations, including but not limited to those of age, class, gender, and sexuality, disability status, that impact if or how one would envision a hopeful future. Our collective desires for a hopeful future are therefore complex and situated. On this land, as indigenous peoples express desires for decolonization, for nationhood, for self-determination. And diasporic peoples confront ongoing racism and white supremacy on the one hand, and assimilationist multiculturalism and ideas of post-race on the other, all while being located on indigenous land and a settler society. And white settlers are challenged to understand the history of Canada, or the US for that matter, is the history of prioritizing white settler desires, which means addressing a politics of humility and allyship, solidarity, and transformation. So historically, science fiction has been a genre dominated by white settler men, but in 2013, Walking the Clouds was published as the first ever anthology of indigenous science fiction. The collection is edited by Anishinaabe scholar Grace L. Dillon, and in her introduction and commentaries that accompany each selection, she relies upon indigenous concepts, including, and forgive my pronunciation, Wadeawe, telling the truth, a concept she draws from Elder Basil Johnston. Essentially, Dillon is saying that many of the tropes of science fiction, the alien invasion story, the dystopian post-apocalypse, and so forth, get tweaked by Native authors who use them to describe the contemporary historical experiences of settler colonialism. Dillon also describes indigenous science fiction as narratives of, quote, Iskabiang, a word that connotes the process of returning to ourselves, which involves discovering how personally one is affected by colonization, discarding the emotional and psychological baggage carried from its impact, and recovering ancestral traditions in order to adapt in our post-native apocalypse world, unquote. Indigenous science fiction stories are therefore often stories about decolonization, and in many, if not most cases, these stories are told from a very nation-specific perspective, as authors give voice to their respective nations' histories and draw upon traditional knowledges and stories to create something new in a science fictional context. So I just want to briefly mention some examples of indigenous science fiction, or what some might prefer to call speculative fiction. Leslie Marmon Silko, who's famous for her novel Ceremony, she has a novel called Almanac of the Dead, which is epic. It's about 750 pages, and portrays the dysfunction and inherent violence of settler society, but builds towards a fulfillment of a prophetic resurgence and reclamation of indigenous lands. There's also Daniel Heath Justice's Way of Thorn and Thunder trilogy, which is on the scale of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, but told through an anti-colonial lens that appears to draw upon the historical displacement of the Cherokee. And Sue Amberstone's The Dreamer's Legacy is a similar anti-colonial fantasy novel that tells the story of an indigenous people's forced removal and reflects the influence of mainstream fantasy genre writing, even as it uses its conventions to tell a story from an indigenous perspective that is generally ignored or otherwise made into a romanticized or demonized caricature. Eden Robinson's Terminal Avenue is a dystopian short story set in future Vancouver, where a traditional Native ceremony is outlawed, and the Native protagonist, Will, works as a novelty Indian performer in an underground nightclub. He struggles with the breakdown of his family and his own Native identity. Here, Robinson is using the well-known form of science fiction future dystopia to talk about the lived historical and contemporary experiences of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And William Sanders' When This World Is All on Fire is a story of a future where Native reservations become a desirable location for white settler climate refugees. In some ways, it flips the conventions of the dystopia. So this imagined future might be dystopian for white settlers, but it raises the question of how indigenous peoples and traditional land-based knowledges and practices may be best positioned to respond to climate change. I also want to draw attention to the work of Zainab Ahmadahi, who's based in Toronto and is of mixed ancestry. She identifies as African-American, Cherokee, Portuguese, Scottish, and Amish. She's the author of Moons of Palmares, which is a science fiction novel that tells the story of the historical quilombos, liberated African slave communities in present-day Brazil, but it's set on another planet. And she recently published Resistance, which is a novel set in post-apocalyptic Toronto, where society is broken down, and the downtown core is emptied out by flight to the suburban areas, and poor, primarily racialized and indigenous peoples are left to try to reconstruct an alternative way of life through reviving indigenous and other traditional spiritual and cultural knowledges and practices, in combination with the use of what contemporary technology they have access to. Resistance is similar to Nala Hopkinson's earlier award-winning Brown Girl in the Rain, which is also about a post-apocalyptic downtown Toronto left to poor, racialized, and indigenous peoples, and the processes of cultural and spiritual revitalization that are at the heart of their resistance to the gangs that rise to power in the absence of state authority. Hopkinson identifies as being of Taino, Arawak, and Afro-Caribbean ancestry, and her novel Midnight Robber utilizes traditional stories and histories of present-day Jamaica to tell the coming-of-age story set on a fantastical planet where traditional indigenous knowledges are practiced by humans and other than human beings. Octavia Butler, Samuel Delaney, Larissa Lai, Nettie Okorafor are just some other well-known writers of color who've written science fiction and fantasy novels from within a settler colonial context of Canada and the U.S. And they address themes of race, gender, and sexuality, colonialism, and recovering traditional culture. Now, I think there's a clear tendency towards desires for indigeneity in some of the most well-known contemporary works of science fiction by white settler authors. Ernest Callenbach's Ecotopia is considered a contemporary classic, and it tells the story of white environmentalists in the American Pacific Northwest who secede from the U.S. to form the nation of Ecotopia, based explicitly on adopting indigenous culture. But indigenous characters are entirely absent from the novel, and so Ecotopia largely repeats the idea of indigenous peoples having already disappeared. Ursula K. Le Guin is one of my favorite authors, and she's the daughter of a well-known anthropologist who wrote the Handbook of Indians of California. Always Coming Home is Le Guin's novel of a future California, where it appears that what we assume to be white settlers have adapted to traditional indigenous lifestyles. The novel takes the form of an anthropologist's report that doesn't substantially address how or why this transformation has taken place. Settlers become indigenous, but we don't know what's happened to indigenous peoples themselves. The theme of settler indigenization is also prominent in The Fifth Sacred Thing, written by Starhawk, who identifies as a feminist pagan witch, and her novel is set in future post-apocalyptic San Francisco, where a multicultural and multiracial New Age community has emerged. So similar to Callenbach's Ecotopia, while indigenous people's traditional culture and land-based lifestyles are the model for the future community, there aren't any actual indigenous characters. And I think the novel can be criticized for the way it appropriates and keeps indigenous peoples out of its story of the future. Finally, I wanted to mention Canadian author Margaret Atwood's just completed Mad Adam trilogy, which is set to be adapted by HBO for a television series. Atwood's novel tells a story of the dystopian collapse of global society from unchecked capitalism and environmental destruction. But one of the main characters genetically engineers a new species of small, blue-skinned humans bred without instincts for greed and hierarchy, who are explicitly described as being a new indigenous people, and they are intended to be the inheritors of a post-apocalyptic Earth. Speaking of fictional blue-skinned indigenous people, there's Avatar, one of the most successful movies ever, having grossed more than $2 billion globally. Avatar portrayed fictional indigenous people, the Na'vi, and Daniel Heath Justice and other critics have pointed out that while Avatar may have brought considerations of indigenous peoples onto a global audience, it repeats the white savior going Indian story, with some calling it Dances with Wolves in Space. Justice in particular criticized the film for allowing the audience to avoid the discomfort of feeling implicated. So the bad guys in Avatar aren't us. So Avatar misses the chance to draw more direct attention into the ongoing everyday effects of settler colonialism for indigenous peoples. Just so you all know, Avatar is scheduled to have 3 sequels, released in December 2016, 17, and 18. So it's going to be interesting to see what directions the story takes over the next few years. And speaking of Dance of Wolves, I also wanted to mention a contemporary science fiction sci-fi channel show called Defiance, in which Graham Greene, a well-known Oneida actor, plays a major role. The show is set in a future where aliens have invaded Earth and terraformed it, and resistance includes humans and several different alien species, including one that appears vaguely coded as Aboriginal. Green's character on the show has a daughter who falls in love with an alien. And while I haven't kept up with the show, it was just renewed for a third season, and I think it's doing some interesting things with ideas of race, indigeneity, intercultural relationships, and anti-colonial resistance. While to my knowledge there has yet to be a full-length Indigenous science fiction film, there have been several Indigenous science fiction shorts that have been produced over the past few years. The Cave is said to be the first ever Indigenous sci-fi film shot entirely in a native language and tells the traditional Chilcotin story of a hunter who accidentally encounters the afterlife while tracking a bear. The film's about 11 minutes and it's available for free streaming on CBC's Short Film Face-Off website. The Sixth World is another short film produced by the American PBS series Future States. It tells the story of a Navajo scientist and astronaut on a mission to Mars. The astronaut, Tasma Redhouse, has a mysterious dream that helps her to discover a way to grow corn on the new planet, thus enabling a new possible future for humanity. Navajo tradition and origin stories tell that the current world we exist in is the fifth world, and so the sixth world on Mars will be the beginning of a new cycle. I also wanted to mention Awakening, which is a short film by Cree Métis director Dennis Goulet. This is a short film set in the near future where the environment has been destroyed and society suffocates under brutal military occupation. A lone Cree wanderer, Misakichak, searches an urban war zone to find the ancient and dangerous Wetago to help fight against the occupiers. So I read or saw in an interview, the director talked about how she drew on her childhood experiences of hearing these stories of Misakichak and Wetago, who were traditional rivals. And she was excited about placing them into a new context where they might join forces against the colonizing force. So to conclude, I just want to mention two other things. A new podcast called Métis in Space that they self-describe as two Métis nerds getting together, drinking a bottle of wine, watching a sci-fi movie or television episode and critiquing it from an Indigenous perspective. I think they've done 9 episodes so far. And the Imagining Indigenous Futurisms Facebook group, which is a great resource for all things Indigenous sci-fi and fantasy, and often includes sci-fi and fantasy from diasporic peoples of color as well. So while this talk may have gone far afield from John A. Macdonald, I hope we will I'll share my hope in the possibilities of new and inspiring stories that work to place Indigenous peoples into the future. In doing so, they interrupt the official settler histories that rely upon the idea of the disappearing Indian in order to sanitize and mythologize the Southern nation state figures like John A. Macdonald. As popular stories of the future continue to be less and less dominated by white settlers, the perspective of Indigenous peoples and diasporic peoples of color are necessarily challenging the foundations of sci-fi and fantasy as we know it. And this is prompting a rethinking of the ideological work these genres have done in supporting the ideas of progress and modernity that were so central to the founding of Canada and the state's genocidal policies and actions. I believe there's a great promise in following the outcomes of these ongoing pop cultural conversations, as they're already inspiring us to think differently about what's possible. Our ability to imagine otherwise about the future says as much about how we might confront obscure historical realities, but it also helps us to think about how we might think and act to bring about a better world for all of us. Thank you.
So my name is Wakiri. I'm Kanaka Maoli from the Big Island, and my mother's line is the Kalipa line. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional keepers of the territory here, the Métis, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. And I'd like to also acknowledge the elders. Thank you for honoring me for attending today's events. I can stand here very humbled, and the basic theme that I want to talk about is this notion of Goswenta and the Eight Fire. And although this is not pretty, it's not made out of beads, shells, and this was given from a student of mine in Tyendinaga. And one of the things I want to throw out to you is that as we progress in what they call this post-indigenous or anti-colonial, decolonial way of seeing the world, as these spiritualities, ways of thinking the world are parts of our body, they're essence that they're not theory anymore, but they are body. So even though this is made out of plastic and hemp and a red string, it's a body. It represents the student that gave it to me. It represents me, and it represents the community that adopted me and taught me a lot of things. So, in the spirit of this talk, I encourage you to think about this thing called the Eight Fire, and also the spirit of what the Tummo Wampum is all about. And I believe that in terms of our post-indigenous world, it's the idea of finding that harmony, to work together, and for each individual indigenous society to find their own pathways. So, I stand before you, actually, I stood right here 10 years ago. And this is what I talked about, the decolonization matrix of the Holomai Pele. Holomai Pele is one of our traditional stories about the creation of the Hawaiian Islands and the teachings of the hula dances. At that point in time, 10 years ago, this is what I thought about decolonization. Decolonization was a process or phases of going from recovery, mourning, dreaming, and action. So, 10 years from now, what have I experienced? What I realized was when I was doing that thing called decolonizing and using hula dances, it was really looking at operational processes, step 1, step 2, step 3. And in my travels now, I'm starting to look at more the intellectual process and relational process of decolonization. Someday, if I get funding, I'll probably look at more of the ethical processes. So, the decolonization process may also be a body. So setting the context, enactment of colonization is separate privileges. But to what extent does it transform our bodies and practices? I challenge you, in the academy and teacher education, we're always looking at words and curriculum materials, but we don't look at what it does to our bodies and the language we speak or how we act and how we talk. And I'm going to challenge all of us that in the education system, we have to move from the grand narratives. We're still in love with that. And that research and pathways are not linear. And that's one of the things I learned in 10 years, that it isn't a process, that the past, the present, and the future happen at the same moment in time. Now, a lot of you are nodding heads, but these are things in the academy that sometimes we need to shake up and go reaffirm that these things actually happen. So in teacher education, we start looking at, to identify, interrogate, and deconstruct, and look at the phenomenology of practice. So we looked at story in the research pathway. And one of the things we're trying to do now with instructors and teacher candidates are the narrative itself. In one sense, what I'm talking is the story of my lifespan of 10 years. And it's about me, but it's also about sharing my interpretation of societies and how I come to realize this version of the Hawaiian body. It's an analysis of the diaspora through post-indigenous contrapuntal discourses. And it's for me trying to make a triangulation of the events. Often the critique of our work is that we come from a certain point of view, but when you start matching things happening in curriculum, popular events, what's happening to your body, you start to triangulate the phenomenon. So one of the things that we're still trying to reinforce is that popular listening, sonic, visual images are reinforced in education, and that the movement of the embodied critique. So, one of the things I'd like to think for you guys to think about is the idea of phenomenology. It's a reflection on it in practice and prepares us for practice. It is a practice of the embodied identity of being, is seeing the world, and value systems of critical and tactical actions. And we're starting to look at what they call unintrusive research and measures. So looking at popular visuals, newspapers, policy documents, and getting teachers to actually analyze that. And the big theme that we call it is self-study teacher professional practice. So post-Indigenous. In our Northern civil society, we are, and that's one of the fundamental questions we're trying to actually come to grips with. So I would argue that being Indigenous can no longer be researched in isolation. It is about the encounters and the reconfiguration of the body coming into contact with being transformed. A lot of the stuff that we've done in the past is, again, the Aboriginal as a study phenomenon. But no matter what, we are going to be interrelated with settler society and Indigenous societies, and it's always going to be intertwined. So it comes back. That's the Métis Guswintut, but this is my Guswintut. And the Guswintut is a body, it is a concept, it is a metaphor. It's also for me for decolonization myself, and I believe it is a body proper. So another thing in our work is looking at contrapuntal discourses. I will make this connection. Contrapuntal discourses are the connections that bind Guswintut together. I'm basing this on Edward Said's reflection on the exile, that hegemonic and marginal are independent and also integrated and related. And I would argue that the body may read contrapuntally, colonizer to colonizing diaspora. And this is, since Friday, this is the themes that we are on two pathways that always intertwine. And the question is, can we do it in a more harmonious way, where we can have really good conversations? So there's another influence of the work is in Sara Ahmed, and that orientations help our bodies find a way, and they can also change. The relationality of our bodies support triangulation of research trajectory, and that the colonization of our spaces and our indigenous desires. Again, we're moving into this world of hybrid gazes with sweeping, introspective, and problematic, and objects and bodies gathered and arranged in the background. So I'm going to show you the next few slides, some of the quick influences. But here's a couple themes to think about. Living the vision or reliving the vision, uncovering the body, exposing the body, and note the complementary and the interdependence for the next few slides. So, yes, MacDonald comes to forefront. Coming over to Turtle Island, I realized that he is, supposedly the founding father of Confederation 1867. I also learned that there's an association with the India Act also. I know it's in the grade 8 2013 social studies curriculum, and they talk about national policy with this gentleman. So, as a teacher, this is what we're exposed to, that he is definitely involved in the creation of Canada, that he is part of a significant individual in our curriculum processes. He's also part of our national policy. Now the question is, as teachers, here are all these very interesting names and historical figures. Who would you like to teach? The ones that you're more comfortable with, the ones you have more resources with. Now, whose body do you want to actually assume and become part of you? Right? And the question we want to throw out to teachers are, you have to be uncomfortable. If you really want to do contrapuntal discourses, you have to say, Gabriel Dumont, Darcy McGree, Big Bear, how do they actually contribute to the significance of nation building? So the question is, to what extent have we moved away from the white father statements, especially in our education system? Historical names are suggested, but to what extent is our teaching practices fully using our historicized bodies? Right? Are we just still comfortable in the settler society and using all those names? So we'll go across the ocean. Kamehameha I, this is what resonates for me. The Pali Lookout, so that is the final battle where he actually unites the island. And there is also a plaque there commemorating the final battle where Kamehameha will unite the entire islands. He's known for preserving the Hawaiian kingdom. And Kamehameha Day is the floral parade and drinking ceremony. But also, in our society, we need to be critical. So to what extent have we moved away from the brown leader representing us? So in our education system, Kamehameha I has been transformed, evolved into a certain political figure of uniting the islands. There was a time where it was a representation of sovereignty, but now he's just a statue where we put lays on. And so the historical names are suggested, but to what extent is our teaching practices fully using our historicized bodies again? But I found something interesting with Hawaiians. Geography is also a body. Geography becomes an embodied ambassador. And what we found in the education text in Hawaii was that they're pretty much glorified tour guide manuals. So these kids' books are talking about the islands with these characters describing certain parts of it. And part of the education now is recommended texts are all about geography. So I'll throw this up to you, that geography is also a body of indigenous Hawaiians. So the questions come. Bodies are related through politics, curriculum, holidays, subjects, and in efforts to preserve our bodies and cultures, we sometimes perpetuate a mixed hybrid body. And we need to address how much we are interrelated and part of that body coding. So when I come to Turtle Island, there are certain things about John A. Macdonald that I'm very comfortable with because there's a lot of guides and there's a lot of curriculum materials, historical textbooks that are recommended for our curriculum. So that's what I'm going to go through. Kamehameha, we always have parades, and that's what I'm going to be associating the unification with. And then you got all these little books about being a good tour guide. And they have connections to the economies that we need to start being more critical of. So, back to Goswenta again. I'm starting to see Goswenta as a body of decolonization, where it's intellectual and relational. And as I go through this process and I start to try to come to grips about this world around me, I am myself trying to light the fire. Now, these are the things that when I lived here started to influence my life. Right? I can still talk about our creation stories and Holomatele, but now with living for a while in Taiyananega, talking and having conversations with my Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe brothers and sisters, these things about the eighth fire and Goswenta are now pushing me to actually start to discover myself. So it is this idea that the contrapunto, this discussion we're having now, is for me to have harmony. And what I'm finding now is that this harmony is through the conversations with the Aboriginal First Nations that I've had so far. So, in terms of sovereignty and unity, post-colonial is the object of study and the text may move towards the body. So I challenge all of us to now, although we have to speak English to have some sort of decent conversation, is that the body proper is now being transformed. It's no longer regalia that we have, it's the voices we talk and the images that we carry. It's also self-validation. We need to be careful that when we start talking with Aboriginal First Nations, is that it becomes normative and permanent. And we need to challenge ourselves in teacher education, that it is always going to be shifting. We need to develop ways of research practice and methodology to understand the past, present, exploitation, and at least develop ways of encountering and respecting each other. And that is our difficulty here in the Academy, which I'm still trying to come to grips with, where we can define our own research agenda. So we do a lot of oppositional readings and bodies, and we get our candidates, even myself, to become witnesses to these differences. We are also producers of shifts of desires. We love certain things. We love, for example, science fiction, or the idea of a better world. We desire to have our own nations. We desire to have our own territory, to be respected, to have our own lands, to have our own languages. We need to find a space here to dialogue and explore how bodies, leading social beings interact and move beyond the limitations of both. And I'm hoping this is what we did this weekend, is creating this space where we can have great conversations. Acknowledge that we have limitations in the way we talk because of our languages or the certain cultures that we come from. Affordances, there are residual encounters. Another thing we need to start to consider is the superiority of Western and white culture. Very provocative statement right there, but I contend that we still do believe that Western white culture is superior to our education system. What are the bearings on the indigenous lifestyles when we have that kind of philosophy and we can give a different philosophy? What happens to our bodies now? And there are still subtle enculturations of colonial products and pedagogy. And what I want to throw out to you there is that in our academy, although we may be Aboriginal Indigenous and we are still doing PhDs or master's program, we still, even us Indigenous people, bring in Western colonizing aspects to our practices. And we still perpetuate that. Provocations? So, we are, some of us, in very privileged positions. So are we still, as teachers of teachers, or me just standing before you, still upholding colonial entitlements? To what extent are our bodies able to challenge the contents, contours, normal procedures of education? So this leads back to leadership. Does leadership, top-down, actually set our standards? There was a time when we had this thing called co-leadership, and that there was also the idea of respecting gender leadership also. What happened there, right? Our bodies, through colonization and racism, has been totally disrupted because of all of this. And, okay, it took me more than 10 years to start saying that stuff. But we need to actually look at what leadership is all about again. Is the future post-Indigenous to move along what is implanted, and what we hold is that we should to have been. So back to this concept. It is not being critical of the past, it's also about making use of the past and letting it dialogue with the present to create new meaning for the future. And that's what I loved about the Friday talk, was because you shook me up again. It's the idea if we can get our teachers and our young people to make use of the past, to really critique it, making contrapuntal conversations, to get them to create new meanings for the future. And that's why we need to keep pushing the provocations to say, you know what, John A. Macdonald, well, there are gray areas to him. You got me to start looking about the hangings and the rebellion, this idea of sedition, which, again, I didn't have it because I didn't have the conversation yet. I didn't get images that pissed me off to actually start thinking, reading, and dialoguing about that. Or the idea of land rights and how actually quite the opposite it is to Hawaii, but talking to Bonnie Jane about the similarities between the territories and Indian agents. So it is actually really for us to have conversations, and that's my fear in our schooling system, is that we really don't have conversations. And until we actually have authentic conversations, that we will still follow the same racism, colonization, and authoritarian education system. So, thank you very much, and someday I will write a book.
Clarification on the post-Indigenous, because it sounds like a master narrative that we were warned about earlier. And I'm wondering what separates in Canada, Canada is the colonizer of Indigenous peoples. So we don't live in a post-colonial state. So post-colonialism theory coming from Said or whoever else doesn't really make sense, it seems to me, in Canada. And decolonial practices are really important because there's a lot we can decolonize in terms of our mind and some of our practices in our body, but we're still in a colonial state, so it's a problematic situation. I'm thinking that some of us think about what I'm calling non-colonial practices that exist adjacent to, apart from, and the two-row wampum is a good indication of that idea of non-colonial practices. And so I'm wondering what differentiates post-indigeneity from the Borg, from assimilation.
I think in terms of post-indigenous, you are correct. From my lens, from my travels, because I think it's when my body leaves my homeland that I can start thinking about post-indigenous, because I can still go back to Hawaii, but I'm not going to be that same body anymore. So I'd like to offer up this conversation of post-indigenous. And I love that conversation. Maybe from the Canadian perspective, there needs to be a little bit more action or movement towards that actually, in terms of the Canadian context, you are still colonized bodies. But for me, the post-indigenous, in my thinking now, is that I'm walking a pathway that I'm trying to make sense of the harmony of being an American, going to Turtle Island, meeting other people, trying to come to grips with that. So it is the idea that I'm going to reject the Hawaiian notion, the Hawaiian state notion of Hawaiian is where you own property and that sort of thing, rather than for young people or for people to know the language and the traditional stories. So I'll be very selfish. Post-indigenous for me is the idea of finding the harmony, but it's also the rejection that I do not like the American definition of Native Hawaiian, and there is also a critique of my own society, of this idea of Kanaka Maoli, where in one sense they want to do blood quantum rather than saying how responsible are you actually to the land. So it is my way of coming to understand my place in my travels. But I will challenge that to all of you, that we need to find definitions. And I'm hoping that maybe this idea of post-colonial, do you love it or not? That's fine, but we need to start talking amongst each other about these definitions rather than waiting for a text from some academic who's put in Canadian German studies about that. So it's the idea of, to keep talking about it. Go, borrow some of your thoughts too. Talk to other people about it.
Love both those speakers. I want to commend Carl, I think, on your subversive re-image Canada, which I think re-imaging, which is the title, and which I don't know if you did that deliberately, but it sure works like fabulous, because if you want to reimagine something, you have to also have the images. We've talked a lot about images today. And I got to get the book list. I think you work a novel idea. Shameless plug for a friend. I've sort of got a little non-linear thinking going on here, but I kind of wonder what Dalai Lama would say if he was in the room. But aside from that, I keep thinking of The Wizard of Oz. Do you remember the ending? They pull back the curtain, and They realized the only reason everything worked is because they believed. Right? Dorothy couldn't go home anymore if home was belief. And as a friend of mine worked at KPMG, it's accounting and tax, by the way, said there's no such thing as money. There's only belief. It's all there. And we have the power to change our beliefs. And we'll come back to the artists. The artists are the ones that will re-imaging where we will go. Sci-fi does some interesting stuff for sure. It helps us see what our heart knows. And I think our heart grasps first and faster than what the mind can ever do. The mind has to follow. And it's the artists that will reach the heart first. Thank you. And what a wonderful couple of days. Really appreciate everybody's voices.
So my question is for Carl. When talking about looking towards the future and these utopian ideas, things like that, how do we avoid romanticizing Indigenous lifestyles, Indigenous cultures in our future ideas? If you can speak to that at all.
Okay. I think this is actually one of my biggest kind of motivating forces is I like sci-fi and thinking about how I want to be hopeful about the future. And I think that it's pretty clear that settler society, industrial society, Western society is unsustainable. And that means transforming to something else. And I think it's, I don't think I'm positioned to answer that definitively at all. I think it's an ongoing conversation.
Sure, it's kind of similar. My question kind of relates to both what David and Becca were saying, but we spoke today a lot about different histories and how we rethinking histories and the different discourses that are present in mainstream society. And some of the books and ideas that you were proposing were reimagining a future, and I think that's really important because it's important to look to the future and how we can start implementing some changes. But I'm just wondering how you think we can do that while also taking into account that there are these histories that we have to be conscious of, and that there has to be a lot of healing for a lot of things that have happened. And how do you see the two incorporating when you're talking about the imaginings of the future?
Well, I think in the examples that I was trying to talk about from Indigenous and diasporic peoples of color perspectives, the way that they're using sci-fi conventions or fantasy conventions is, in a lot of cases, by talking about the past, but reframing stories that have been ignored or marginalized and telling them in this new context that makes them available for a new popular audience.
This is very, very quick. Have you written any books? Do you have any creative ideas for future stories that you've been thinking of, or?
Sure, but I have to finish my dissertation first.
So I guess we'll say thank you to Carl and Umar, and then open the floor up to. Oh, sorry, Pat.
No, that's all right, because I just want to ask something.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll just say thank you so much to Carl and Umar for joining us today. And then we'll open the floor to a broader discussion about the series in general, and then maybe also how to look at the next, this upcoming year, and what can we do as a group to engage in the bicentennial commission, or bicentennial commemoration celebration. And yeah,